This is chapter 9 and the afterword of the Boys' War. This chapter is called We're Going Home. This first picture is William Black, who was 12 years old when his left hand and arm were shattered by an exploding shell. He's considered the youngest wounded soldier of the war. He's 12. By late 1864, most of the giant battles of the Civil War had been fought, their names sounding like so many thudding cannon booms. Shiloh, Antietam, Chancellorsville, Vicksburg, Gettysburg. Each took a fearsome toll in lives. Each brought the war a step closer to a resolution. Now Sherman was driving his army deep into the South, splitting what was left of the Confederate army and leveling cities and villages in his path. The war dragged along until April of the following year, when the commander of the Confederate Army, General Robert E. Lee, officially surrendered at Appomattox. Elisha Stockwell and his company were marching toward Montgomery, Alabama, when we got the news that General Lee had surrendered, and we lay there all day and celebrated. They lined up the artillery of the whole command and fired a gun just about as fast as one could count. An officer sat on a horse at the right of the gun, and he had a small flag called a guidon. Every time he made a motion down, a gun was fired, so the firing was as regular as a clock. This sounded nice to us, as it was the death knell of secession and meant the cruel war was over. The next day, Stockwell and a friend gathered up their belongings and began walking home. The ringing of bells and the firing of cannons announced the successful end of the Civil War to Northern troops and civilians, but many soldiers, especially those fighting for the Confederacy, learned by simple word of mouth. We started back, one Southern boy wrote, and it was not long before we began meeting soldiers from Lee's army. These men stated that Lee had surrendered. At first, we thought them deserters. We pushed forward. The faster we marched, the faster these soldiers came, until at last the courier met a man he knew. This man confirmed the report of Lee's surrender. I turned to the courier and asked, "What are you going to do?" He answered, "I'm going home." I then said, "I'm going with you." He did not object. As both Stockwell and the Southern boys show, soldiers still possessed a remarkable degree of independence. They had signed on to fight until the war was over. Now that it was, the army could not tell them what to do. Thousands of soldiers from both armies simply left camp without waiting to be officially dismissed from duty. Southern soldiers had another reason for taking off so quickly. If they could avoid being captured and forced to surrender their weapons, they would strike a small personal victory for their side. The reception these boys received at home varied, of course. A grand review was held in Washington, D.C. for those Union soldiers who had not wandered off. 200,000 marched up Pennsylvania Avenue, past the President, his cabinet, and tens of thousands of cheering citizens. They were proud of their achievements, an officer remarked, and had the swing of men who had marched through half a dozen states. Needless to say, this wasn't a typical military parade, as the officer notes. The feature of the column which seemed to interest the spectator most was the attachments of foragers in the rear of each brigade. These men appeared in their native ugliness as they appeared on the march through Georgia and the Carolinas, their pack mules and horses with rope bridles or halters laden with supplies. It was a new feature in a grand review, but one which those who witnessed it will never forget. The reception given Union soldiers in their hometowns and villages would be smaller, but no less spirited. The boys were not just heroes, they were walking miracles. They had fought and preserved the Union, and they had survived a war that had killed and injured a frightening number of soldiers. This celebration of relief and praise would continue for several years, culminating in a gigantic Peace Jubilee in 1869. There, a chorus of 10,000 singers and almost 1,000 instruments welcomed the soldiers home with what had to be an overwhelming rendition of "When Johnny Comes Marching Home." When Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah, hurrah, we'll give him a hearty welcome then, hurrah, hurrah. The men will cheer, the boys will shout, the ladies they will all turn out, and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. And we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. Confederate soldiers returned to a somewhat more subdued welcome. The South had lost the war, of course, but most soldiers did not feel defeated. For 4 years they had held off an enemy that had more money, men, and supplies than their side, and they had inflicted severe punishment on them too. Most felt that if a few things had gone in their favor, they could have carried the fighting on longer and defeated the North. This feeling grew into a passionate belief as time went on. Regiments of Southern soldiers would meet for years to follow to debate what had happened and why. Adding fuel to this was a simmering anger that few tried to conceal. 8:30. We are moving briskly towards Richmond, John Delaney would write, and about 12 in the day I step off the train and proceed up the street. I shall not attempt to describe my feelings. The city in ruins, and the hated and triumphant army of our malignant foes marching through the ruined city. With a raging headache and a swelling heart, I reach my home. And here the curtain falls. But the most common reaction must have been one of shock at the changes the war brought to their society, the landscape, and themselves. One Confederate boy struggled for several days to get home, avoiding Union soldiers and eating what he could find along the way. Then he writes, I reached home May 25th, 1865. I found my father and mother working in the garden. Neither knew me at first glance, but when I smiled and spoke to them, mother recognized me, and with tears of joy clasped me in her arms. My father stood by gazing upon me in mute admiration. Their long-lost boy had been found. Afterword. The war was over. Soon the homecoming celebrations, parades, and cemetery dedications were over too, and the nation began trying to sort out what had just taken place. The result was a barrage of books written by politicians, soldiers, and historians from both sides. Curious thing happened during the writing of these various histories. The role played by boys in the war seemed to have been forgotten. The War Department tacitly acknowledged the extent to which boys had taken part in the war. They effected a series of procedure changes that made it almost impossible for an underage boy to enlist in the Army, even in the supposedly non-combat positions of musician and telegraph operator. This meant that the Civil War was the last time large numbers of boys were able to fight for the United States. Some boys did write about their experiences, but most of these writings were published privately and never received the acclaim given to books written by older men. Not until fairly recently did historians take a serious look at who had participated in the war and realize how many boys had managed to enlist. This shouldn't have surprised them, however. Boys have always been among the first to volunteer to fight. It happened during our own Revolutionary War, and it is still happening today in places like China, Latin America, South Africa, and the Mideast. Initially, boys might join the army to find adventure, to escape boredom, or to be where their friends are. But in the end, they fight and die for the same reason as older soldiers, to defend their homes and their freedom.